Hello and welcome to this week's very special summer edition of Future of XYZ. We have the privilege of, I was just teasing him about what a fangirl I am, the founder of Island Oysters, Skip Behnett, direct from Duxbury, Massachusetts. Skip, welcome to Future of XYZ.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm honored to be invited.
Well, it's really such a pleasure for me. As I was saying, I am a big oyster fan, but I am especially a big Island Creek oyster fan, as many people in the world are. You started it, I believe. You're from Duxbury. Your family's many generations in Duxbury, Mass., which is down near Cape Cod, south of Boston, for all of our international and West Coast listeners who know nothing about New England. It's a really tough business, but you are one of kind of the pioneers in shellfish hatchery. You started with clams and you moved on to oysters and in 95, and then in 2000 really brought on some partners, including your dad. I mean, I just want to ground people. I mean, most people have a vision in their mind of what an oyster is, but like, what is the scientific definition of an oyster?
So oysters are bivalves, they're mollusks. And that's kind of a broader definition. They are, there are many different species of oysters. So the species that we grow is Chrysostrea virginica, and that is indigenous from kind of the Gulf of Maine down to the Gulf of Mexico. There's a little bit grown on the West Coast too. And so there's all these different species that are grown in different places, but that is what we grow here on the East Coast.
And you have said in previous conversations and in marketing materials that, you set out to grow the world's finest oysters. So there's obviously a more emotional definition than the Latin name for the varietal that you grow. Talk to me about that emotional definition of oyster for you.
So I think for me, there's a couple of things. I think there's something really primal about growing oysters that, I think Anthony Bourdain had a pretty cool quote where he says that we eat them very similar to the way our knuckle-dragging forefathers ate them, plucked fresh from the ocean and slurped out of the shell that it grew in. And so I think that's unique, right? Like, we don't eat a lot of foods that way. And then beyond that, I think that, it really connects you to a sense of place. So when you eat an oyster, it really smells like the ocean. So it can bring you back to, like, being on the beach and smelling the ocean and the sand and the seaweed. And, and that should be what an oyster tastes like. Yeah. And then beyond that, on a kind of a more granular level, there's, this real sense of place. In wines, they use the term terroir.
Yes.
We have kind of messed with that a little bit. We call it merroir.
I love it. I've not heard that before.
So an oyster in Duxbury will taste very different than an oyster in Barnstable or Wellfleet, and certainly different from an oyster that's grown in, say, Maine. But also, the oysters can taste different based on, if they're grown on one side of the bay or the other. And they can be drastically different. So it really brings you, you can sit in a restaurant and eat 6 different varieties and almost be transported to those places.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, because I've talked about, I was saying to you before, how many people I've introduced oysters to over the years who were like, ew, gross, like slimy, and then like find their love of oysters. And we talk about terroir. I've never heard merroir. I love that. It's like totally like changed. But obviously Duxbury Bay, where you grew up, where your father was a lobsterman, it's very cold, very turbulent, very saline, very, very salty. This produces quite a special oyster. Like, talk to us a little bit about how they're grown, how they're farmed, and then exactly as you just said, the merroir that makes each one kind of so unique and special.
Yeah, so the farming process starts in the hatchery. Every summer we do tours. I think we have about 5,000 people that come through, and they go into the hatchery for about an hour, and then they see the outdoor nursery and go out on the boats and see where the oysters are harvested. But the one commonality in the whole thing, people always say to me, I had no idea how much went into farming oysters. So, like I said, they start in the hatchery in the winter. So that's sort of an indoor laboratory where we grow kind of copious amounts of phytoplankton because that's what the oysters eat. Um, so
Phytoplankton is the luminescence,
uh,
or not necessarily.
the bioluminescence, that is a
Yeah.
type of plankton, yeah.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if that's a phytoplankton, but we grow about a dozen different species based on, the different cell sizes and nutritional values so that we can really kind of manipulate the diet of the oysters at the different stages of their lives. And that goes on for a few months in the late winter, early spring. Once the oysters are big enough there and the time is right. So generally around the middle of May, the oysters move out into tanks outside. So they start to eat the food out of the raw water. And then we're kind of off to the races from the time that the seed comes out of the hatchery until we can start harvesting. That's about 18 months. And I would say to people, like, to put some context to the challenge of growing oysters, that 1 million oysters will fit in your 2 hands and weighs about 2 to 3 pounds when it comes out of the hatchery. Wow. 18 months later, it completely covers 1 acre and weighs about 200,000 pounds. So it's the expansion of that volume that is one of the bigger challenges for oyster farmers.
Yeah, you have to have land, but it's not land, it's sea.
And it's also geared to protect it because until it's, about 6 months into its life, they're pretty fragile. Everything wants to eat them.
Understood. Nature's cycle. You've been doing this for quite a while. 95. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it turns out that it actually was. You were, I believe, the first, if not one of the first vertically integrated shellfish farms in America, at least. What changes have you seen in the course of these, 30 plus years, and kind of over in your world as well as in the industry overall?
Yeah, I think, there were certainly farms out on the West Coast that were vertically integrated. And, the history of oysters, there were oyster farms. They were more kind of wild oysters that were caught and then, people had the rights to harvest them. So that went on for a long time and goes way back in our history. But it wasn't until the 50s and 60s that oysters there were 2 diseases that almost wiped out oysters completely on the East Coast. So in the 80s and 90s, some of us started, and, there were quite a few people before me that were farming oysters and really started to grow oysters. So that was kind of the genesis of the whole thing. And, I would say the biggest changes that we've seen are the amount of farms.
Yeah.
It's just staggering. You go, I have a friend that has a small plane, so we were flying over Maine, and it seems like every nook and cranny has a little oyster farm. And, that's a big change from when I started.
Absolutely. It's funny. I spent a lot of time in my life in Maine, actually, and on the New England coast. I mean, it is, lobstering, oystering, being on the water 4 seasons of the year is tough work. You get that rugged New England kind of mentality and image, it's the opposite mountain man. It's like the ocean man, but you get that vision. It's tough. Like, as we think about like the changes, but you've also obviously faced quite a number of challenges, I imagine, both of the natural variety as well as the man-made variety. How do you deal with that in the face of the other changes, like so many farmers who are now doing this?
Yeah, I think that, that's the one thing that I think some people, don't really understand is it is farming. So, we grow live animals in one of the most harsh environments on the planet. And so it's very, we can't control, certainly can't control the environment that they grow in. So once they're out there, they're really on their own. And, we deal with disease issues, which, the best we can do is good husbandry and, really selection in the hatchery. So, good breeding to select kind of disease resistant animals. And then, there are more, bigger challenges like climate change. And then there's also the, kind of user conflict. So the NIMBY, not in my backyard, that still persists really up and down the entire East Coast. Surprisingly, that, not in my backyard is a big issue up in Maine, where you would think that, the traditional working waterfronts, that people would be more supportive of seeing oyster farms.
Well, and it's certainly a changed landscape as more money comes into the coast, and
for sure,
and the two things battle.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that people move up there to be where, the lobsters come from and the fisheries, and then they don't want to see it in front of their house.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're gonna do a wind energy in Rhode Island. It's a similar topic soon, and it's the same kind of thing, right? I mean,
yeah.
I don't want to see those turbines, but yeah, support wind energy. But that's a different topic. So, I mean, you had a couple of restaurants in Boston. You now have 2 shops in Duxbury. You have a shop up in Portland, Maine. I think you serve as a distributor for a lot of different, seafood farmers and distribute to 700 some odd chefs around the country. Most of all, you've been served at the White House. I mean, Island Creeks. And the House Oyster for one of the most famous restaurant sisters in the world, which is Per Se in New York City, and the French Laundry in Napa Valley. I mean, that's been going on for a long time. It's quite impressive.
20 years that we've been the signature dish at Thomas Keller's restaurant. So it's an amazing honor. And, there was kind of the serendipitous, series of events that led to us being the oyster at Per Se first, and then later at French Laundry. And, it's amazing that Chef Keller and I are coming on 20 years of working together, and we're friends. We have, a fantastic relationship and a lot of respect for each other. So, but for me, it's truly an honor to be the oyster that is served there.
Well, I mean, it's a real talisman of the quality that Island Creeks are. You started also Row 34 in Boston, which was a different oyster. You have many varietals now. I know you don't have that anymore, but the point is, you now have a D2C, a direct-to-consumer business as well. I get the text, the special occasions, all the rest of it. It would seem that, yes, are more farms, but there is growing demand for oysters.
So that's an interesting one, that when in the mid 90s, when I started growing oysters, it was out of desperation, because in 1990, I started growing clams. And then in 95, I got wiped out by a disease. And believe it or not, there were no wild oysters in Duxbury. So when I got oyster seed, I didn't even know if it would grow in Duxbury Bay, which, we jokingly say that Cape Cod Bay is the kind of Napa Valley of oyster farming. And we didn't even know if they would grow here. So, that was a long time ago. And, I'm sorry, I lost. What was the question?
No, why growing demand for oysters?
Oh, the growing demand. That's right. Yes. So, when I started selling oysters in the city, there was probably a dozen restaurants that had oysters on the menu. So there weren't really many oyster bars. There weren't oyster programs like we see today. So, multiple varieties of oysters and oyster birds. Chris Schlesinger at the East Coast Grill up in Cambridge was way ahead of his time. So anyway, we thought we would saturate the market very quickly. And what we came to realize was every year the demand outstepped the production. And we had a couple of breakthroughs where we broke some bottlenecks, where it was like, oh, here we go. We're going to way outstrip the demand. But what we didn't account for was there was always kind of this latent demand. And I think even people like you said, your friends that at first were like, I'm not eating oysters. Like, they didn't even know they liked oysters, because there weren't really that many wild oysters left, largely because of the diseases in the 50s and 60s. So it wasn't until, we had hatchery seed, we could breed for resistance, that all of a sudden there were a lot of oysters out in the market. And 30 years later, almost 30 years later, the demand still far outstrips the production, which is hard to believe, because, like I said, there's oyster farms literally every nook and cranny of the East Coast. But
as you said, there are a lot of factors that weigh into how you get from a seed, into a full-grown oyster: time and luck and salinity and all sorts of other things.
And luck.
A lot of luck, right? and hard work. And I mean, I think as we think about sustainability is a big important topic in my world, and almost always on Future of XYZ, we end up coming to either social impact or sustainability issues. I think sustainability well, first of all, in all farming is a topic because of the fact that like demand outstrips production and supply. So if you don't mind talking, I know you guys have a strong point of view on sustainability and what it means for the next generations. What is sustainability in oyster farming and specifically for Island Creek?
Well, I think the farming activity in of itself is, is inherently sustainable. It's probably the only protein I know. So it's a really nutrient dense protein that actually improves the quality of its environment as it's growing. So, and I can't think of another source of protein that where we see that. Um, the as far as as opposed to a wild fishery that's extracted, we're replenishing the crop every year, and also like with the clams we grow, it's augmenting the wild fishery. So those clams that we're growing on the farm are reproducing, and the larvae shellfish are settling all over the bay to increase the wild population. So like I said, the farming activity in and of itself is very sustainable.
Which is very helpful. And then I think we talk about the next generation. I think you say you run a vertically integrated farm dedicated to making an impact on our food systems. What explicitly are you able to do? I mean, you mentioned the fact that oysters filter the water. They also provide, security beds. I mean, New York City's talking about putting in oyster beds, of course, to shore up the area around against hurricanes, climate change, and other ways. What other things do oysters do for the planet, as well as what are you guys doing to kind of bring that to fruition?
So I think a lot of this is just through the practice of oyster farming, but probably the biggest ecological service is the remediation of nitrogen. So when we live in and around the water systems, we're putting a lot of nitrogen either through fertilizers, but also even perfectly functioning septic systems leach nitrogen. And, ultimately that can lead to or will lead to excessive algal blooms. So, the limiting factor of algal blooms is nitrogen, and I suppose phosphorus as well. And so when we put an excess amount of nitrogen into a bay like Duxbury Bay, we get excessive algal blooms that eventually will deplete the dissolved oxygen. So
they become dead zones.
They do become dead zones. And the oysters are not only efficient at removing the phytoplankton, the plankton, but also they can remove the nitrogen in a host of ways. There's also a belief that oysters are sequestering carbon to build the shell. So they lock it up in the shell. Ultimately, that shell ends up hopefully in somebody's driveway.
Well, that's exactly it, because the shells themselves have purpose.
Yep.
Or they can, as building materials, as you said.
Yeah, there's this whole kind of cottage industry now of people, making Christmas ornaments out of the shells and, all kinds of art out of the oyster shells, which I think is so cool.
It is. It's like when we were kids and we found things on the beach and made that art out of them. Now it's actually a business.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's pretty good. So, I mean, here, obviously, you are focused in Duxbury. However, you have started, I believe, a nonprofit that's operating in Africa, in Haiti, which of course is extraordinarily poor and been ravaged by, political unrest, social unrest, but most of all, natural disaster. What does the future, like, why are you investing in social entrepreneurship and these kinds of nonprofits as so far away from where you grow oysters?
Yeah, I think, from the beginning, we always felt like we were very privileged to be able to work out on the bay. Ultimately, it's public land, and, we have this incredible opportunity. So from the beginning, we've always tried to give back. And years ago, we put on an oyster festival, and like everything at Island Creek, like everything at Island Creek, it grew. And it got out of hand, but we made a lot of money on those. And we, had committed ahead of time that whatever money we raised would go to some type of charity, and certainly food production, and, food production for people that really needed it was something that we identified as not only important to us, but similar to what we were doing here. We're creating food. So we got involved in a project in Tanzania through Woods Hole Oceanographic, and we built a shellfish hatchery over there. So we kind of
New
seeded.
Zanzibar, I assume.
Yep, yeah. So we seeded a lot of the money for the build out of the hatchery, but we also spent a lot of time there physically building the hatchery and trying to get it to work. And that project is still ongoing, although we're not involved. We did our part in that, but it still exists today. And then through Paul Farmer, Dr. Farmer, we got involved in Haiti, which we were working on a fish farm project there. So we were farming tilapia in some of the inland lakes, and it was an unbelievable program. And unfortunately, it's kind of all come undone with some of the uprising there, and
Heartbreaking.
yeah, it was heartbreaking. You can't even get to the hatchery anymore. So
I'm sorry.
and then there's challenges that I think it's hard for us to perceive how different the world is in these places. And it could take a lifetime to really have much of an impact. And and then 6 years ago, we bought a property in Duxbury that I used to joke when we first got it. I said I felt like the dog that caught the car, because it was way more than we could afford. And there were a couple of times where I was like, we're not going to survive this acquisition. So we've let the sort of development nonprofit part of our business, we kind of set that down for a while. And I think we're getting ready to get back, and maybe with a little bit different purview this time, maybe something closer to home. And, who knows? But I think that is something that's important to all of us. And I can't tell you how many great people have come to work for us and ultimately said, I came to work because of the foundation. Yeah. I really wanted to be part of that. So it's really important to me that we get back to that now that we're more stable here.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. I think the future of, we did a conversation just around Thanksgiving last year on the future of farming. And farming, as you've said, is hard work. And so wherever you can, give back to the next generation of education, of learning, of best practice, we all need it. So I give you huge support for whatever that's going to look like. As we think about wrapping up, Skip, we're obviously future of XYZ, so the future of oysters. In your opinion, like, what does the next 5 to 10 years look like? What does the industry need to survive and thrive, or to be successful? And is this the same thing kind of globally, East Coast, West Coast, et cetera? Or is there something specific to New England?
Well, I think, there are things specific to New England, but I think on a broader scale, I think, a little more research, and you think about, how many varieties of tomatoes you can buy out there. And we're still kind of chiseling out the wheel, of shellfish aquaculture here. So, certainly some genetics and some, investment in research would help. And that's coming. It's going to happen. And then I think one of the bigger challenges is access. So, it's also, there's so many benefits of aquaculture, not just the ecological services, but also, the economic impact locally. So you think about 150 people working on Duxbury Bay, and $8 to $10 million that are produced out there, really like a foundation level of development, that those dollars they're unique, and they're rippling through the economy. And I've been saying lately that this is the best version of Duxbury I've seen in my 57 years. And awesome. Largely, I think because of all the dollars that are coming into our community, and, the grocery store, the coffee shops, and the sandwich shops that are all thriving now, those are the amenities of the community. And that's really important to not just to us, but all the people that live here. So, I think the problem now is that many people don't see that value. They don't understand how important oyster farming is beyond, how much money we pay in rent, or, so I think getting that message out there would certainly help with the development of aquaculture.
I appreciate that. So as a final question, you've been doing this for almost 30 years. Imagine out another 20. What's your greatest hope for the future of oysters?
That I'm here. That I'm part of it. I hope in 20 years I'm still farming. And, beyond that, I hope that Island Creek persists into the future long after I'm done. And, I think I hope that the industry continues to grow and, diversify. We're growing a lot of different shellfish now. We grow these surf clams that are generally harvested out in the ocean, and we grow them up to about 1 inch. So in the wild, they're harvested at 5 inches or bigger. Yeah. So they're used for chowders and that kind of stuff. But we grow them to a size now that we're using them for fried clams, and they're unbelievable, way more sustainable than softshell clams. So, I think hopefully shellfish farming as a whole becomes more robust and a little more secure too, a little less risky for the people that are involved.
Skip Behnett, founder of Island Creek Oysters, thank you for joining us on Future of XYZ. It's a truly delicious topic.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for including me.
And for everyone watching, make sure that you follow us on Instagram. You can also listen anywhere you get your favorite podcast to Future of XYZ. And if you're listening and didn't know you could watch, every episode is available at future-of.xyz or our presenting partner, Rhode Island PBS, at ripbs.org/XYZ. Go visit, leave us a 5-star review, and go get yourself some oysters from Island Creek Oysters. Skip, thank you again.
Thanks, Lisa.